We're going to talk about some recent regulatory developments that are important to crypto, but let's start with one that continues to reverberate in the crypto world and be discussed, which is the XRP ruling. And I've already done a few shows about this, but one aspect that we really haven't touched on, which you dissected in a long tweet, is that the SEC has, a few different options of what it could do here. And you kind of talk through which strategy it might choose or, how the different strategies look. So walk us through that. How likely is it to appeal or not?
So I think it's very likely that they'll appeal. They're probably looking at this decision and thinking it's flawed in certain ways that led the court to grant Ripple's summary judgment motion with respect to the programmatic sales and the other distributions. The real question is, and they're running that analysis now, right? When Chairman Gensler is saying, we're continuing to assess the opinion. I mean, they've clearly read it, and they read it immediately when it came out. What they're trying to do is see how, basically assessing the judge's reasoning, looking at the case law she cited, and considering her conclusions in that regard, and then looking and trying to guess what the Second Circuit would do with this case. I expect that they're going to come to the conclusion that the important parts of the case where the judge said programmatic sales were not a securities transaction, other distributions were not a securities transaction, they'll just say she got it wrong, and so we should appeal. Then the question is when. As other guests have told you on previous shows, they don't have the right to appeal now because the case isn't final. What they'd have to do if they wanted to appeal now is basically very soon, either by the end of this week or early next week, because I think they have to do it within 10 days. They have to tell the district court, Your Honor, we'd like to appeal your summary judgment decision, and we're going to ask you for permission to do that. And then they have to essentially present an argument to the judge why she should allow the case to basically be put on hold while they go to the Second Circuit and ask the Second Circuit to review her decision. There's going to be some briefing papers on that. They may even argue it in court. All the while, on a parallel track, the judge and the magistrate judge assigned to the case are going to be preparing for trial and doing all the administrative and evidentiary things that are attendant to that. But let's say the judge says, okay, it is important enough an issue. It would be more efficient to decide this issue now at the Second Circuit rather than waiting to the end of the case. And I think you sort of see the judge anticipating this issue by saying, are the parties going to settle now that my summary judgment ruling is out? Because a lot of parties, once summary judgment's over, they don't want to go to trial on some side collateral issue. Basically, the case has been decided. And so rather than belabor things, they just settle the rest of the case out. And then they tell the judge they're settled. The judge writes a final order. And then you can go to the Second Circuit if you want to about the summary judgment motion. Assuming they can't settle and assuming the judge says, yes, it's important enough, I'll let you appeal, they will then have to go to the Second Circuit.
So just clarify for listeners what parts still remain that they either could settle on or would go to trial on?
Yeah, so summary judgment is a part of the whole pretrial process where you're trying to narrow issues to reduce them down to really only questions of fact that go on to a trial, because a trial is all about determining what the facts are. In summary, a summary judgment motion basically are both sides saying these are the established facts and all of these facts are material to the claims. And if there's no disagreement as to the facts, the judge can just apply the law and end the case. Here, the judge said there's a question of fact as to what the executives at Ripple, what was in their heads when these institutional sales were going along. And so because the parties don't agree as to what the fact is there, whether they intended to do these, whether they knew about these sales, we got to send that to a trial where you're either trying to present evidence to a judge and convince a judge or a jury about these things. So that is the lone issue, whether the executives knew or intended the institutional sales and thus aided it and abetted them in some fashion.
Okay, so what do you think is the likelihood that Judge Torres would approve the appeal? And what is the likelihood you think the Second Circuit would accept one?
It's very hard to say. Very hard to say. I could see it going either way. Honestly, I think if I was a betting person, I'd expected her to certify the case for appeal. And then if it goes to the Second Circuit, again, very hard to handicap what they think about it. It's a pretty important issue. The SEC would feel very strongly about them taking it. Maybe that persuades them to take it. But at the Second Circuit level, you have to ask permission. And once you get permission, that's when the substantive briefing comes in. So this could take a very long time.
Your conclusion was that the SEC would probably not like the odds it would have if this were to go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So if you're saying that they probably will appeal, it sounds like they probably only wanted to go, just a certain distance, but not all the way to the Supreme Court. So what do you kind of think would be the most expected choices they would make?
So as everyone knows or should know, Supreme Court gets to choose its own cases. Just because a case is really important doesn't mean the Supreme Court is going to take it up. Generally, when there's a single case that's really important, it's important because it involves some fundamental question about, the scope or the meaning of the Constitution. If it's just a question of like how to interpret federal law, they generally only take them when a number of these appellate courts around the country all reach different conclusions on basically the same issue. So if this goes to the Second Circuit and the Second Circuit comes down one way or another, really the only way that the Supreme Court would want to take this case without there being other appellate courts around the country reaching a different conclusion is if it raised basically a fundamental question about the scope of the authority of the SEC. And it does raise that. So look, if it gets to the Second Circuit and the SEC loses, I don't think that they would appeal. Maybe that's wrong. If they get to the Second Circuit and Ripple loses, they're certainly filing a cert petition, basically asking the Supreme Court to take their case. And what they would basically say is, along the lines of all the cases that you've issued in recent history and actually over for the course of, a couple decades now, that says administrative agencies have to follow the instructions that Congress gave them and can't play jazz to their heart's content with the authorities they've been granted, either to redefine the scope of their authority in an established field or redefine it for purposes of taking on a new field. Like, this is that case that you've been deciding again and again, but decided in this context with respect to the SEC's authorities under the securities laws. Would that be something that the Supreme Court is interested in taking up? There's certainly a chance that it would, or the Supreme Court could say it's not big enough issue yet. Let's see what some other circuits say on this issue, and then we'll take it up. But it's a big risk the SEC runs by taking it to the Second Circuit on their own accord, because ultimately the crypto ecosystem, and Ripple included, views these issues ultimately being decided by the Supreme Court at some juncture, barring the legislature actually changing the game completely.
And then why is it that you were concluding that the SEC probably wouldn't like its chances at the Supreme Court? What is it about this Supreme Court that you feel would be unfriendly to the SEC?
They have been taking a much more conservative and small c conservative and disciplined view as to the authority of administrative agencies to view their originating statutes and then define for itself what its job jar is. What are the areas of the economy that we are able to regulate? And how can we regulate those areas? In a recent case involving the EPA, the court said, EPA, what you were trying to do, Congress never gave you authority to do, and it's not your place to take that authority on for yourself. That's effectively what it said. Now, that similar issue has been a refrain in the crypto community about the role of the SEC in regulating digital assets. There are certainly digital assets which are explicitly securities, and there are certainly digital assets that might be based on how they were issued, what they do. But to just broad brush everything in this space, with the exception of Bitcoin and maybe some other proof of work tokens, everything either is a security token or a securities transaction, that envisions an overly expansive view of your own authority to regulate this new area that Congress never gave you and certainly couldn't have contemplated back in the 1930s when these laws were originally enacted. The SEC's counter to that is like, those laws were incredibly broad, and we're given the authority to interpret them in ways so that mitigate investor risks and market risks in ways where we don't constantly have to go back to Congress to ask for new authority in a new area. It's, you've heard the chairman say this, it's very flexible. We're given a lot of discretion, and we've determined all of this fits within our box. Forgetting the fact in 2021, he said, we don't really have enough authority here, and you guys need to act. You, Congress, need to act. Memory holing those statements and never recognizing again. Their position now is, we have the interpretive authority, everything's in the box. And crypto's like, no, this is too broad of, you are too broad in your interpretation of your own authority. And so you look at the Supreme Court and how it's been reining in administrative state overreach and caprice generally. And you look and you see that this is like the next logical progression of that line of jurisprudence.
All right. So in a moment, we're going to look at some new bills that could definitely impact crypto and attempt to address some national security issues with them. But first, a quick word from the sponsors who make this show possible. Arbitrum stands at the forefront of innovation as the premier suite of Layer 2 scaling solutions, bringing you lightning-fast transactions at a fraction of the cost, all with security rooted on Ethereum. From DeFi to gaming, Arbitrum One plus Nova is home to over 500 projects. And with the recent launch of Orbit, Arbitrum welcomes you to build your very own tailor-made Layer 3, or an Orbit chain. Propel your project and community forward by visiting arbitrum.io today. Ondo Finance is connecting the on-chain economy to real-world assets with compliant, institutional-grade tokenized securities. Ondo's flagship product, OUSG, a tokenized U.S. Treasuries vehicle, brings the roughly 5% yield from Treasuries on-chain. Ondo is also launching a tokenized wrapper of government money market funds, OMMF. Investors can learn more and subscribe to Ondo's products at ondo.finance. Ever wanted to use DeFi without being tracked? Railgun is the leading DeFi privacy solution on Ethereum. It's available on BSC, Arbitrum, and Polygon 2. Shield your funds and use them privately in your favorite DeFi apps, while Railgun's cutting-edge, zero-knowledge system encrypts your data from public view, all without leaving your preferred chain. Yes, that includes DEX trading. Coming soon are integrations with leading yield, lending, and perp trading platforms on multiple chains. DeFi and privacy, together at last. Visit railgun.org or use the Railway app at railway.xyz to find out more.